Today, we're going to try to answer the question, what is philosophy? This is a good topic for the first lecture of this course, but I also have another audience in mind. I also intend for this video to be shared with the parents. I teach these courses here at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and at the end of every semester, I have a few students who come to me and they say, I want to major in philosophy, but I don't think my parents are going to like the idea. I don't even think they know what philosophy is. And I always have to say to them, one day I'm planning on making a video version of the introductory lecture where I explain to them what philosophy is so that they realize that their child majoring in philosophy in college is actually maybe a very good idea. And now I've finally gotten around to making that video. Here it is. The first thing to do in trying to answer the question, what is philosophy, is to talk about the word. The word philosophy comes from Greek. It's made up of the words philia, which is a Greek word for love, and sophia, which is a Greek word for wisdom, and so together they mean the love of wisdom. But that's useless. Forget about that. That's not going to help us in figuring out what philosophy is as an academic subject today. You should also, before we begin, forget any associations that you have with the word philosophy. People use it in all sorts of weird ways in society. We're just talking about the kind of work that you will do in a college-level philosophy course. And in these courses, you are going to try to answer questions like the following. Does God exist? Do I have free will? And what is free will anyway? Which actions are morally good? And for that matter, which actions are morally bad? What is the fair way to arrange society? Finally, does my mind continue to exist after my bodily death? You might be thinking that these are not only the kinds of questions that come up in a college-level philosophy course, but these are also the kinds of questions that seem to occur to other kinds of people. These questions occur to children and stoners, and they also occur to, religious leaders. Let's take these groups in order. We'll start with the children. Questions like these do naturally occur to children, and children stop thinking about them, but they stop thinking about them not because they've produced well-supported answers, but because they get busy with dating and taxes and all the stuff in adult life, and they just sort of stop trying to answer these questions. What academic philosophers do is they don't stop trying to answer these questions when they get older. They keep trying to answer them in serious, rigorous ways. And that, of course, is what distinguishes the philosophers from the stoners. Stoners will talk about questions like these, but in a sort of casual, fun way. When philosophers do it, it's less fun. It's still a little bit fun, but they take it extremely seriously. Now, religious leaders and religious people and religions in general, they also take these questions very seriously. And so you might be wondering, okay, well, what distinguishes, philosophy from religion? There are two things. The first one is that religion seems to rely to some degree on revelation. Consider, for example, this question. Which actions are morally good? Religious leaders will say that they have the answer given to them. It was revealed to them. Whereas philosophers, academic philosophers, they are trying to produce an answer to a question like this. They're trying to answer a question like this without just trusting what someone has said, even though that thing that that person might have said may have been the right answer, right? They don't want to just trust what someone said about it. They want to come up with an answer to this question produced entirely from, valid arguments and rational thought. Of course, some religious leaders, some religious people are also philosophers, right? So there are many famous philosophers throughout history and who are alive today who were deeply religious, but they wanted to answer at least some of these questions using just rational thought and not also relying on, revealed truths in texts or whatever, even if they think that those texts contain real truths that come from God. The second way that religious leaders and religions seem to differ from philosophers and philosophy is that in the case of religion, there are restrictions on the answers that you can come to when you're answering these questions. The question, does God exist? You can conclude that God exists, you're still a philosopher. You conclude that God doesn't exist, you're still a philosopher. But if you go through all the arguments and you conclude that God doesn't exist, then you're not a priest anymore. Enough with the different groups of people for now. So when I was an undergraduate, this is all I got. I just got a bunch of examples of philosophical questions, and I got the assertion that philosophy is the attempt to rigorously, seriously answer questions like that. But I think we can do better. I think we can probably say what all of these questions have in common that makes them philosophical questions. First, though, let's go through some of the wrong answers. When I ask a group of students, what do they think all of these questions have in common? The first answer that I always get is that all of these questions are subjective. This isn't a silly answer. Some matters really are subjective. Take, for example, the question, are pickles tasty? The answer to this question is different for different people. The people who like pickles say yes, pickles are tasty, and the people who don't like pickles say pickles are not tasty, and everyone's right. Matters of taste are subjective. But all of these philosophical questions, I don't think they are subjective. In fact, I think none of them are subjective. Take, for example, does God exist? That's just a question about whether some type of thing in the universe exists or not. Does Bigfoot exist? It's not a matter of taste where it changes for different people, like Bigfoot exists for me, but he doesn't exist for you. No, he's either there or not. Same thing goes for God. And it's worth noting that the mere existence of disagreement doesn't demonstrate subjectivity or whatever. One of these things happens after your body ceases to function, after your heart stops beating and all the neurons in your brain stop firing. Either your mind continues to exist somewhere, or it doesn't. I don't think any of these issues are subjective, at least not in the sense that the tastiness of pickles or the tastiness of anything is subjective. Okay, so I'm ready to offer my explanation for what all of these questions have in common, but in order to do that, I'm going to need some space on the board, and so I'm going to erase all of these questions now. When we're trying to determine if a question is philosophical or not, the first thing we have to do is determine whether it can be answered with observation or experimentation. Here's a question. I'm really going to ask you this question. I want you to really answer it. Chickens. Do chickens give birth to live young, or do they lay eggs? The answer is that they lay eggs. How do we know that chickens lay eggs? I'll tell you. We watch the chickens. Babies don't just fall out, it's eggs. The eggs fall out first, and then they sit on the eggs or something, and then the eggs hatch into chicks or whatever. So we answered this question, a biological question, by use of observation. If a question can be answered by observation or experimentation, then that question is what we call empirical. You don't have to remember the word empirical, but that's the label anyway. And biological questions fall into this category. Also questions of history, questions in physics and chemistry and economics and all sorts of stuff. These are empirical questions. Okay, but not all questions are empirical. Here's an example. The number 9. Is it a prime number? You know what a prime number is? A prime number is a number that's only evenly divisible by itself and 1. Is 9 a prime number? No, 9 is not a prime number because you can divide 9 by 3 and get 3. But notice that we didn't answer this question by observing the number 9 because we've never observed the number 9. This right here, folks, is not the number 9. This is a numeral that represents the number 9. Here's another numeral. This is a Roman numeral. It comes from Southern Europe. This is an Arabic numeral. It comes from the Middle East. These are just shapes. These are bits of ink on a piece of glass. The number 9, whatever it is some abstraction. It's not on the board right now. These are just numerals. They're not actual numbers. The numeral here, the Arabic numeral for 9, it can't be divided evenly into 3 parts. How would you divide it? That doesn't even make any sense. The kind of division we're talking about is not just like chopping something up in space. And the kind of thing we're talking about when we talk about the number 9, it's not something that you can observe, it's not something that you can run an experiment on. When we discovered this fact about the number 9, that it's not prime, and it really is a fact, this is a fact, folks, we didn't discover it by way of observation or experimentation. We must have discovered it some other way. Questions of mathematics like this, they're what we call non-empirical. And when we have a non-empirical question, we can ask a further question about it, which is, can it be answered by way merely of some proofs or calculations that get run from stipulated definitions or axioms? Let me try to explain this with another example. Here's a question, and be extremely annoying and persnickety and literal when you answer this question. What is this object? It's not a triangle. That is a bunch of ink on a piece of glass. A triangle is a two-dimensional polygon with 3 sides. This is not a two-dimensional thing, right? This is made up of some ink, and the ink is made up of molecules, and the molecules, although they're really skinny, are not completely flat. This is not a two-dimensional object. This is a 3-dimensional object. You've never seen a two-dimensional object because two-dimensional objects like triangles don't exist. At least, triangles don't exist in the world that we live in. You've never seen a triangle. All you've ever seen are, drawings of triangles, which are 3-dimensional things made up out of particles, right? And maybe you've seen the corner of a building that's triangular in shape, but that's just a building. That's not a triangle. Okay, you've got to believe me, right? You've never seen a triangle, right? Think about everything that you've ever interacted with in your life. Like, look around you wherever you are. You're watching this on a screen of some kind. The screen is made of glass. That's just more molecules like hydrogen and I don't know what it's made out of, silicon and whatever. Those are just atoms. They're all 3-dimensional. They're stretched out. They have a height and a width and a depth. Everything you've ever seen, your face, your nose has a height and a width and a depth. Everyone you've ever met, every rock you've ever stepped on, everything you've ever interacted with is 3-dimensional. You've never seen a triangle. No one's ever discovered a triangle, right? I don't care what kind of ink you use to draw it. All ink is made up out of particles, out of molecules or atoms or whatever. So ink can never draw or create a true triangle because triangles are just imaginary things. They're things that we made up. We stipulated that they are defined a certain way. We just made up the definition. Stipulated means made up. We made up the definition of a triangle. We said it was a 3-sided enclosed polygon, 2-dimensional polygon or whatever. And then we also stipulated some axioms. Axioms are just additional stipulated claims in addition to definitions. And then when we discovered facts about triangles, and just in the same way that we discover facts about the number 9 or whatever, like the fact that the interior angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees, we discovered that fact just by coming up with some made-up definitions for something that we had never observed, and we still have never observed a triangle. This doesn't mean that math is worthless or anything. Math is amazing. It's just not empirical. We stipulated these definitions, and then we produced some proofs, or we ran some calculations from them, and we discovered some things like that the interior angles of a triangle always sum to 180 degrees. Okay, so arithmetic and geometrical questions, they're non-empirical. You can't answer them by observing or running experiments, but you can answer them by doing proofs or calculations based off of stipulated definitions or axioms. So we have questions that are empirical. They're answered by observing what's going on in the world or by running experiments. We have questions that are non-empirical, but that you can answer them just by running some proofs from some definitions that you just made up. And then there are questions that cannot be answered in either way. Those questions are the philosophical ones, or so I'm claiming. So that's my answer to the question, what is philosophy? Philosophy is just all the leftover stuff. Okay, so let's test this definition of philosophy. We're going to test it by taking one of the questions that we started with and seeing where we put it, in this diagram. What is the fair way to arrange society? Can a question like this be answered empirically by observing or running experiments? No, it can't, because all we can observe is how societies are in fact arranged. But this question is not about that. It's not asking, are there kings and queens, or is it a democracy? No. This isn't a question about how society is arranged. This is a question about how it ought to be arranged. This is a question about which way of arranging society is fair or just. And you're not going to figure that out by just looking at societies, because looking at societies, observing them, is only ever going to tell you, at least directly, it's only ever going to tell you how societies are actually arranged. But when we're talking about this question, we want to know how they should be arranged. And also, we're not going to answer a question like this with experiments, right? Say that we run some experiments, like we put a bunch of people on a deserted island somewhere, and we see what happens. That will just tell us how their little society becomes arranged, how it will be arranged if certain conditions are prevailing or whatever. But that's just a different question. Maybe it's a very interesting question, but it's not this one. And then also, this is not a mathematical question either. It's not a question that has to, do with proofs that are run from stipulated definitions or axioms, right? Society is a real thing. It's not like a triangle that we never observed and we just made up a definition for it. Society is a thing out there, and we want to understand it, maybe, and we want to understand what is just or what is fair about different ways that it could be structured. We're not going to answer a question like that by running some calculations with a calculator. This is a philosophical question. It goes in this category, and you might be wondering, well, how are we going to answer it then? The way we're going to answer it is with arguments, or rational thought. And when I say argument, the kind of argument that we are going to engage in this philosophy course, when I say argument, I don't just mean like, two people are arguing with each other by screaming at one another or whatever. No. An argument, as academic philosophers use the term, is a series of statements that are structured so as to rationally persuade someone that something is true. Now, the fact that philosophers have to answer these questions with nothing other than rational, clear thought and argument and that sort of thing, that fact is going to have two very significant consequences. But I'm not going to tell you what those consequences are. First, I'm going to deal with some objections that people sometimes have to the very practice of philosophy. Deal with those objections, then we'll get to the consequences. The first objection is this. Anything goes. If you don't have observation or experimentation to fall back on, and if you don't have sort of like rigorous mathematical proofs to fall back on, well then, when you're doing philosophy, can't anybody just say anything? And any answer to any of these questions is just as good as any other answer? Anything goes, right? No, I don't think anything goes, because some arguments are better than other arguments. Some patterns of reasoning are clear and rigorous and logical, and other patterns of reasoning are not. Throughout the course of this semester, we are going to see dozens and dozens of examples of arguments, and some of them are just going to be better than others, and we're going to be able to break down the ways in which some of them are better than others. So it's just not true that when you give up, empirical observation, and when you give up mathematical proof, you're left with nothing with which to assess or evaluate the quality of the answers to the questions that you're trying to answer. So it's just not true that anything goes. Okay, that was the first objection to the practice of philosophy. Here's the second objection. Philosophy doesn't produce anything. And so because it doesn't produce anything, it's not worth doing. Well, it's not exactly true that philosophy doesn't produce anything. It produces clear, rational arguments. It produces well-supported answers to the kinds of questions that we were talking about earlier, that I wrote up as examples on the board, right? That's what philosophy produces. It produces rational, well-thought-out, well-argued answers to those questions. And so then, if we want to know whether or not philosophy is worth doing, whether it's worthless or not, we just have to ask, well, is that product, well-thought-out, well-supported answers to those questions, is that product worth having? I suggest that it definitely is. To see this point, consider one of the questions that we were talking about earlier. Does my mind continue to exist after my bodily death? Is that an important question? Yes, I think it's an important question, and I think you think it's an important question. Everybody agrees that at some point your body dies. Your heart stops beating. If your mind, or your soul, or your consciousness, or whatever, if that continues living somewhere else forever after your body stops functioning and disintegrates into the dirt, if that happens, well then you are immortal. You can't really die in the interesting sense, although your body can die, but who cares about your body? You, your memories and your thoughts and your personality, all that stuff will keep going if your mind continues to exist after your bodily death. That seems to be like one of the most important, interesting questions that someone could ask about themselves. Am I immortal or not? Do I continue living forever? Don't you want to know? Are you immortal? If you want to know the answer to that question, well, then the way to find the answer is to do, serious, logical, rational contemplation about it or whatever. If an answer like that is worthwhile, if it's worth having, then philosophy is worth doing because it will get you an answer like that, or at least it's the only way to get you an answer like that. For that reason, it's just false to say that philosophy doesn't produce anything, and it just seems to me like it doesn't follow that philosophy is worthless. Notice something also. The question of whether philosophy is worth doing, that's also a philosophical question, right? If we go through this diagram, right, is this activity worth doing? Well, that's not an empirical question. It's a question about what ought to be done, right? And what ought to be done, as we saw before, that's not something that you can answer by just observing or running experiments. So because it's a normative question about how things should be, what you should do, what activities are worth doing, because the question is like that, it's not empirical. It's also not mathematical. You can't answer it by running some calculations from some stipulated definitions or axioms. And so therefore, the question of, is philosophy worth doing? That's also a philosophical question. So someone who tries to use this kind of attack against philosophy, well, they have to be doing philosophy. Okay, now we're ready to talk about the consequences. Let's keep this moving. The first consequence of this definition of philosophy is that the answers to philosophical questions are going to be controversial. You can't fall back on, experiments, you can't fall back on mathematical style proofs, and so, it's going to be harder when you have fewer tools with which to answer questions. It's just going to be harder to settle on agreed upon answers. This consequence of this definition is actually kind of good for the definition itself. You see, the definition of philosophy that I'm giving is actually a fairly controversial one. That is, lots of philosophers are going to disagree with me about the answer to the question, what is philosophy? But according to this answer, the question, what is philosophy, is itself a philosophical question, right? We're answering it right now, not by way of experiments or observations, not by way of some proofs or calculations run from stipulated definitions or axioms. No, we're answering this question in the sort of standard philosophical way. So this answer predicts that it itself will be controversial, which it will be. The second consequence of this definition of philosophy is that philosophy is hard, right? You have fewer tools. You don't have experiments with which to answer these difficult philosophical questions. You don't have mathematical proofs. All you have are the sort of ordinary tools that we use in our ordinary lives. All you have are words and clear thinking and arguments. These are things that everyone uses every day, and they're the only things that philosophers have to use in order to answer these very difficult questions. And so what happens is you get very good at using those tools. Here's an analogy. Say that you want to make some iced tea, like instant iced tea from powder or whatever, like Lipton or I don't know. This class isn't sponsored by Lipton. You pour the powder into a glass, and you pour the water in, and you mix it up with a spoon or whatever, and there you've made some iced tea. Chemists in a chemistry lab, they use similar tools, right? They'll use a glass container, although maybe a slightly fancier one, and they'll pour in the ingredients for the solution that they need to produce or whatever, although they'll pour them in a much more precise, much more careful way. But they're doing basically the same thing. And then they'll mix all of the stuff together, but they'll use a specialized tool that's a little bit better than the spoon that you have at home, and they will use that tool in a very, very careful way. And so what chemists will do is they'll get very good at, mixing stuff together. They acquire skills. That's what happens when we do philosophy. We're using basically the same tools as everyone else. We're using words and we're using thoughts, except for we're using them much more carefully. And so then when we want to go back to our regular lives and make iced tea or produce an argument in any other context outside of, the philosophical realm, we're just good at it. And because we get good at it, maybe that's why we do so well on standardized tests. We've now come to the part of this lecture where I talk about how well philosophers do on standardized tests. Let's start by talking about the GMAT. It's a standardized test that you have to take before going to business school. So if you want to go to business school and become rich as a business whatever, you've got to take this standardized test. Here are the average GMAT scores broken down by major. Look at how well the philosophy majors are doing. That's kind of cool and kind of surprising. They don't do as well on this test as, physicists or mathematicians, but they do better than chemists or historians or political scientists. Okay, cool, fine. What about the LSAT? The LSAT is another standardized test that you have to take before you go to law school. It's the law school test. Philosophy majors do the best. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because philosophers are practicing using clear, rigorous argument to answer philosophical questions, and, lawyers have to use arguments in the courtroom or whatever, or in writing, wills or whatever lawyers do. Then there's the GRE. The GRE, I think this one stands for the Graduate Requisite Exam or Record Exam or whatever. This is the standardized test that you have to take if you want to go to graduate school in some ordinary subject like economics or biology or history or sociology or English or whatever. It's just like the SATs. There's a math section, there's a verbal section, and there's a writing section. And if you take all three of those sections, if you average out the scores on all of them and then add them all up, you'll get a composite score for the GRE, and the breakdown by major looks like this. Look at this. This one is crazy, right? The philosophy majors are doing way, 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 way better than even English and political science and physics and astronomy. This is impressive stuff, folks. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I don't care about standardized test scores. All I care about is material wealth. Money. That's all I want, is money, money, money. How much money am I going to make if I try to answer these deep, profound philosophical questions or whatever? The answer seems to be, more than other people. Here's a graph of the mid-career salaries for non-STEM majors. STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Philosophers are making more than people who major in business economics or marketing. All right, cool. So maybe you can be rich. Okay, but you might have a question at this point. Are these the kinds of reasons that I should use in deciding what to major in college? Should I decide my major based on how much money it's going to make me? Or on how well I'm going to do on some standardized test in a few years from now? Well, that question about why one should study philosophy or not, that is itself a philosophical question. You're not going to figure out what you ought to do or why you ought to do something from observation or experimentation, and you're not going to figure it out by running mathematical proofs from stipulated definitions or axioms. If you want to know whether some group of considerations, like how much money you're going to make, is the right kind of thing to take into account when making a decision like that, you're going to have to do philosophy.